Today we'll talk about the Ukrainian defense industry. We'll cover a lot of ground, like the current locations and products, the challenges it faced after the fall of the Soviet Union and in recent years, why the Russian defense industry did better, and many more aspects like certain parallels and differences to the US defense industry. To cover this large ground, we have a special guest. Someone who you probably are familiar with, since I quoted him probably 100 times. I'm very happy and honored to present to you Mr. Steven Zaloga.
I'm going to show here a number of slides just to give a brief summary of the Ukrainian defense industry. To start off with, Ukraine constituted about 15% of the research, development, and test establishment in the former Soviet Union, and also roughly 15% of the production facilities. And what that amounted to at the end of the Cold War was about 700 dedicated defense plants and about 500,000 employees. So it was a very significant fraction of the overall Soviet industry. And more importantly, there were several plants and research facilities in Ukraine that were absolutely central to the Soviet military. So I'm going to show you a few of the major industries and the most significant of the industries. What I might add, though, is that many of these industries have been renamed over the past few years. So it is a bit confusing. So I'll try to identify them both by their Soviet era names and by more contemporary Ukrainian names. So let's start with naval systems, because this is really one of the most obvious. Most of the Ukrainian portions of the maritime industry were located in Nikolaev, currently called Mykolaiv. And that included two large shipyards, 61 Communard and the Chernomyrsky shipyards. These shipyards were responsible for the construction of practically all large Soviet warships. So it included destroyers and frigates at Nikolaev North, and it included aircraft carriers at Nikolaev South. That was the only yard for aircraft carriers in the former Soviet Union. Now, the other absolutely critical production facility was the Mashproyekt yard, sometimes called Zarya, also Mykolaiv. And that produces the very large naval gas turbines that power most modern warships. Some Soviet era and contemporary Russian ships do use nuclear power plants, but most of other large warships use large naval gas turbines. These were practically all built in Ukrainian yards. So that's a significant problem that Russia faces now, because these facilities are in Ukraine. And then finally, there were some very specialized bureaus in Ukraine, and Slavutich NPO in Kiev was one of those. It was responsible for many of the ASW sensors, meaning sonars and other anti-submarine warfare type sensors. So in the naval field, a significant fraction of the Soviet production was in Ukraine. And now, under current circumstances, these are no longer accessible to Russia. If we jump over into the aerospace field, the most significant of these was Yuzhmash, the Yuzhnoye plant in Dnipropetrovsk, currently called Pivdenia. That was the main Soviet ICBM plant. That was the premier plant for the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles. So it developed missiles such as the SS-7. A more contemporary one that most people will be familiar with was the SS-18, also called the Satan by NATO. The Russian name was R-36. They also built the SS-24, the solid fuel missile. And they had both the design bureau there, the Angle Design Bureau, and the associated production plant, Yuzhmash, and a solid fuel rocket facility at Pavlograd. So a very, very important aspect of the Soviet military industry. Now, that industry has been largely dismantled. The US government in the 1990s paid the Ukrainian government to dismantle certain aspects of it, especially the solid fuel plant. The plant still does work on space boosters and other projects, but it's only a small shadow of what it once was. Another major missile plant is Artyom, also located in Kiev. That was one of the main Soviet era air-to-air missile plants. They built the R-27, also called by NATO the AA-10. They were also the lead plant for R-77, which is the most modern of the Soviet era missiles, also called the AA-12. There's a relatively new industry in the Kiev area called Lush that produces ATGMs. So if you see video film out of Ukraine now of missiles like Stugna, that's from that plant. They also build anti-ship missiles. So if you heard about the Neptune missile sinking the Russian cruiser in recent months, that came from the Luch plant in Kiev. They had a significant air defense missile, a SAM plant called Juliany Vizar in Kiev. That built the S-300P, also known as SA-10. That plant I don't think is quite as active as it was back in the Soviet era. Another important plant was Hartron. That is a ICBM inertial guidance plant. That was one of the two main inertial guidance plants in the Soviet Union. They make the inertial navigation systems for ICBMs and other large ballistic missiles. Then getting over into more aircraft-oriented products, the most famous plant in Ukraine was undoubtedly Antonov, the designer of most Russian transport aircrafts, the Antonov 2, the Antonov 10, the 12, the 22, aircraft such as that. They're located in Kiev, and they had a facility up at Hostomel, which people will be familiar with because, of course, there was a big battle there. So that was a significant plant. And then another plant, which people are probably not as familiar with, is Motor Sich in Zaporizhzhia. That builds gas turbines, especially helicopter gas turbines. So if you have an Mi-8 helicopter, the Mi-8 is built by the Mil Bureau up in Russia, but it's powered by Motor Sich engines. And Russia has tried to reestablish a new gas turbine plant in Russia, but they've had real problems selling Mi-8 and Mi-17 and Mi-24 helicopters in recent years because the engines were coming from Ukraine. And then finally, if we go to tanks and armored fighting vehicles, the most significant plant was the Malyshev plant in Kharkov, now called Kharkiv. That was the leading Soviet-era tank plant. That plant developed the T-34. It developed the BT tanks prior to World War II. It was the lead plant for the T-64 tank of the 1960s and 70s. It later built the T-80UD. It was working on various advanced tanks. Then in the post-Soviet period, it built the T-84 Uplot tank. It's exported tanks to Pakistan, to Thailand, to a number of other countries. There's another plant, another armored vehicle plant in Kharkov, the Kharkov tractor plant. That works on light armored vehicles, so that includes vehicles such as the MTLB, the 2S1 self-propelled gun, the MTLBU command vehicles. And then finally, there's a railway plant in Kremenchug, which builds combat engineer vehicles, the tracked engineering vehicles used for combat engineering purposes. And there's some new independent developments in Ukraine. So, for example, there's the BTR-3 and BTR-4, which are being developed at the Malyshev plant in Kharkiv. So that may be more familiar to people who have seen recent videos of Ukrainian vehicles running around. There are some new indigenous Ukrainian designs. And then finally, just a quick note about Ukraine defense spending. The Ukrainian military has had real problems over the past 2 decades funding their defense production. They simply have a very small defense budget. To give you some sense of that, last year's defense budget was roughly equivalent to $4.4 billion. To give you some comparison, the Polish defense budget that same year was $13 billion. So the Polish budget is on the order of 3 times as large. And of course, Poland is a slightly smaller country. And Poland itself is not enormously wealthy as far as its defense budget is concerned. As far as the Ukrainian budget goes, procurement is about 12% of the budget, so not that large a fraction. Its research investment is relatively modest. It's only about 1.1% of the overall budget. And then finally, its exports have not been particularly large. It's been about $100 million a year in recent years. Ukraine exports some new product, but they also export a lot of old Soviet era products. So you would have seen over the past decade, Ukraine was selling off things like T-64 tanks or old artillery pieces. And that, of course, is a problem now because they sometimes need that old equipment. So there's a basic roundup of the Ukrainian defense industry.
From my understanding, so about 15% of the Soviet Union is there, from the United States. I'm not sure if there's data available, but is there some comparable state in the United States which did something similar. So maybe, I don't know, Texas, but I'm not really aware of the American defense industry.
In the American defense industry, the two big states would be California and Texas. California used to be the center of the aviation industry. It's lost a lot of those plants in recent years because of cost of labor. The cost of labor in California is higher than in Texas. So you see a lot of plants moving down to Texas. So, for example, the main F-16 plant is down in Texas now. The same is true if you went back 30 or 40 years ago to World War II. The state of New York was a very big aerospace producer. You had Bell, you had several other, Fairchild, Republic, other plants there. Same thing. They moved away from New York due to cost of labor, the high cost of labor in the state of New York. And also New York has the added problem in that it's in one of the colder regions of the United States. And so it's more expensive to heat the plants during the winter months. So you've seen a migration of the U.S. defense industry from the northern states and from the expensive states such as California and Washington to the low cost states. So it's Texas and some of the states in the Southeast.
So from the size, would it be comparable? California, basically what California was for the US defense industry, what Ukraine was for the Soviet defense industry?
I strangely enough, I actually don't deal with the U.S. defense industry on that level. I don't try to measure it by state production. I would expect that California or Texas would probably be in a similar area, something in the neighborhood of maybe 15-20%. But that number varies enormously through time. As I say, it's changed over the years, and it changes due to programs. So, for example, at one point in time, a plant will be building F-16s, and then F-16 production ends, and some other company wins the contract, and then they're building F-22s up in St. Louis or something. So that's a consideration also. But yeah, I would expect that some of the bigger states would be comparable to the situation as in Ukraine.
So it seems the U.S. defense industry seems to be more dynamic from the location in contrast to the Soviet one, because Kharkiv, like BT, T-34, T-64, T-80. So we have more of a legacy there. Is this correct?
It depends on the industry. Some industries use rather fixed facilities. So to give you an example, in the tank industry, the U.S. really only had two tank plants, both located in the Midwest. At the end of the Cold War, one of them was shut down, and now only one still exists in Ohio, the Lima plant in Ohio. So those have remained fixed, and those plants actually go back to World War II. So the old tank plants, because it's a very specialized industry, they've tended to stay in the same place. The aerospace industry, aircraft production, missile production, is very dynamic. Part of it is because the technology changes. We've gone from an industry which relied on, as they call it over here, metal bending, where you're literally working with just metal structures, to now people are working with carbon fiber. And so when you're building newer generations of aircraft, they require all new machine tools to do the aircraft. And as a result, you may take a look at an old plant and say, no, it would be cheaper to go and build a brand new plant in Texas than to use an old plant in California, even though they've already invested in the plant, because it's going to require all new machine tools. And the real cost is the machine tool, not the actual facility.
What you mentioned before, it seems Russia had certain problems, like with the turbines for the helicopters, to basically establish new plants in Russia itself in that regard. So do you think to some degrees there's a motivation to conquer these plants or to get them back, but basically they will be destroyed during the war likely?
I don't think that the Ukrainian defense industries are an objective of the current Russian invasion, for the simple reason that where they're located and the way the war is being fought, the plants would probably be destroyed in the process of trying to capture them. There are some facilities that the Russians undoubtedly want to regain control of. A clear example is Mariupol. Mariupol is not actually a producer in the sense of a prime contractor. They don't build completed weapons, but they are a major element of the former Soviet steel industry. So, for example, tank turrets, the tank turret castings were done practically entirely in Mariupol. So if you go back to the Soviet days, you'll see that most Soviet tanks had cast turrets. You look at a T-64, a T-72, T-80, cast turret, coming off from Mariupol. They lost that capability, so now you'll see on a T-90 or on a T-14, the turrets now are welded construction. Well, that's because they lost the Mariupol facility. I'm not saying that they're trying to take over Mariupol to regain casting capability, but Mariupol is a very important part of the steel industry, and undoubtedly, Russia, if it remains in control of Mariupol, will rebuild the steel industry there because it's a very important part of the industry. I'm sure that Russia would like to have control of Mykolaiv, the Mykolaiv port facility where all of the large warships were done. Now, if they destroy it in the process of capturing it, it's going to take a substantial investment to rebuild the shipbuilding industry. But the main advantage of Mykolaiv compared to the northern Russia yards, because there are shipyards in St. Petersburg, there are other Russian yards. The yards in Ukraine are in fairly good weather conditions. As soon as you start getting up towards St. Petersburg and the northern ports, you're dealing with extremely severe weather conditions in the winter months. So Mykolaiv has an obvious attraction simply because the weather is more suitable there, and it's a great port. So it's ideal from a shipbuilding perspective. But the other facilities, for example, the tank plant in Kharkov, the way this war is going, these cities are being destroyed in the process of the Russians capturing them. So I don't know how attractive it is for the Russians to try to regain them. The Russians did take over some defense plants in 2014 when they took over parts of the Donbass. They did send in vehicles and truck off defense equipment, machine tools, and that sort of thing. So that did occur, but that was a very different circumstance than the current war.
So in a way, it's mostly, if it's around the defense industry, it's to a large part about the location, also to the access to the Black Sea, I guess, and also to regions that have a warmer climate. I mean, you made already the comparison with New York that it costs more. And recently we had a Bulgarian analyst, and he basically stated or assumes that there was some problems for, I think there were northern ports where there was problems with paying the electricity bills. And so it iced everything up and actually destroyed the equipment. So this problem would be less severe in Ukraine due to the milder climate. I mean, Black Sea is definitely less chilly than St. Petersburg.
Yeah, the ship design is still done mostly up in Petersburg. All the design bureaus, the naval design bureaus are all located up in St. Petersburg, but the actual construction, a large portion of that was down south, down on the Black Sea. Also, some of it was on the Crimean Peninsula. When the Russians took over Crimea, they also gained a couple of smaller shipyards there. The other problem that the Russians face, or that the Ukrainians themselves face, is that although the Ukrainian industry was very large and very prosperous in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, the industry suffered greatly from 1991 to today. There was very little funding, and that especially had to do with human capital, with the engineers and the designers. Over 30 years' time, the experienced designers who were in Kharkov with the tank plant or with Yuzhmash with the missile plant, they all left. They became taxi drivers. They emigrated to the United States. They emigrated to Israel. A large amount of the talent that used to be in the Ukrainian defense industry left or they retired. 30 years ago, keep in mind, if the engineer was 40 years old 30 years ago, he's 70 years old. He's retirement age now. So some of the most important aspects of the Ukrainian defense industry are gone. On top of that, there was very little investment in new machine tools. So a lot of the equipment is old. The defense industry was cut off. The Ukrainian defense industry was cut off from the Russian industry. And in many cases, they were integrated. So, at Kharkov, they'd have a tank plant, but some of the subcomponents would come in from Russia. So it became difficult for both sides to do it. The Russians depended on Ukraine for some subcomponents, and then Ukraine depended on Russia for other subcomponents. It was an integrated industry, and that caused tremendous difficulty. Now, through 2014, it wasn't as big a problem because Russia and Ukraine were trading. The Russians were sending SS-18 ballistic missiles down to Ukraine to be refurbished because the Ukrainians had that capability at the Yuzhmash plant. Once 2014 happens, that doesn't occur anymore. The defense cooperation between Russia and Ukraine starts to end. And that's where Russia starts to have problems in its defense industry because it's losing this capability that Ukraine has.
Wow, it's very interesting. Yeah, that the whole interdependence part, this also to a certain degree probably explains the rather small export number of 100 million annually. Of course, that's also probably to a certain degree explained due to the threat from Russia as well. Because yeah, you can only sell that. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the drain on the human capital or the designers, because many years ago, although this is from memory, so I might be wrong, there was the game IL-2 from Alex Maddox. And I remember in the 90s, I looked at the homepage of his staff, and it was basically aerodynamics designers and all like high-level engineers. And I was like, these guys are developing computer games now, or it looked like he hired half of the MIG development department, and now this comes back. So this is actually kind of makes sense that they migrated or became taxi drivers or something else. So if the industry is not, or the whole legacy is not used to getting money or incentives, then of course it dies off.
And that's happened across the board in the former Soviet Union. You know, if you take a look, I've met some of the designers from various of the games, you know, War Thunder and World of Tanks and IL-2. And it's mostly a young crowd. Some of those were young people who were working in the defense industry. But a lot of that is the young talent who, instead of going into the defense industry, go where the money is, because there's much better money in the entertainment industry in doing those war games, those computer-based war games. And so you have a tremendous amount of talent from Russia, from Belarus, from Ukraine going into that. And you also have a drain out of all of those countries, from Russia, from Belarus, from Ukraine, to other countries. So if you go to an Israeli computer firm, you're going to hear a lot of Russian spoken. If you go to a lot of American firms and you sort of listen to the accents and you pick up a foreign accent somewhere, there's a good chance the foreign accent you hear is going to be Russian, because a lot of young Russians, you know, when they looked at their opportunities in the 1990s, they said, we have no opportunity here. There's no money. There was no money at that time in the Russian defense industry. And so they said, okay, it's time to emigrate. So you meet a lot of Russians in American defense firms. You meet a lot of Russians in Israeli defense firms. So that's had an effect also.
Right. It's also that America is really good in attracting talent, because I remember, if you look at the academic landscape in Austria or Germany, and then in the United States, who does the PhDs? And usually the Germans and Austrians and others in Europe get frustrated, and the best sometimes go to the United States and do the PhD there. And I once made a short paper in university and talking about the brain drain, which of course the worst brain drain of course happened in Germany in the Second World War. But in my experience, it didn't particularly stop, because it seems Germany and Austria is not particularly good sometimes in keeping at least academics.
The US engineering business is somewhat like that, in the sense that if you attend engineering schools, you notice that there's distinct cultural trends. I started out in engineering back in the late 1960s, and if you visited an engineering classroom at the time, most of the engineers or engineering students were from the generation of recent immigrants. And so most of them were kids whose family was Italian or Jewish or Polish, or from the immigration waves that came into the United States in the 1920s. So their parents or their grandparents were immigrants. And the people who went into engineering were the children, the children or the grandchildren of the immigrants. It's a tough field, and they were willing to work for it. Now, if you go into engineering school, it's the same story, but it's a different group. You go into engineering classes now, and the kids you're going to see there are going to be Chinese, Pakistani, Indians, Russians, the children and grandchildren of recent immigrants. And same thing, engineering is a difficult field, and the recent immigrant families are far more willing to do the work that's necessary to prosper in engineering. And so there's this very distinct shift from generation to generation in American engineering. And then you see it in the defense industry, because the defense industry is hiring out of the engineer schools.
Yeah, I mean, in Austria, I have a degree in computer science and history. And in Austria, basically, computer science is seen as an engineering degree, although as an easier one. And I was at university, and I saw the stark difference of what is demanded what you need to do to pass in computer science in comparison to get a straight A in history and other degrees. And also there are some statistics which basically state engineering is the only one, I think, for Germany, where the social background of the parents is irrelevant. Whereas, for instance, in business, basically the parents come from have more money, and if they are humanities, usually they are the first generation to ever go to university. I got a big off track here, so let's go back to another challenge Ukraine faced.
One of the problems that Ukraine still faces now is that they simply don't have enough investment in their defense industry. Even though they had a large defense industry in 1991 when Ukraine separated from the Soviet Union, the problem has been is that for 30 years they haven't thrown any money into it. And as a result, what used to be absolutely classic defense industry plants, for example, the Kharkov tank plant, the Malyshev plant, or Antonov, the aircraft design bureau, or Yuzhmash, the missile design people, they've been starved for funds. So they haven't been able to develop the human capital, the trained engineers and designers. They haven't been able to keep up to speed on new machine tools, new equipment, and they haven't had the investment simply in the supply of material. And so, in the case of a tank plant, they don't have access to the amount of steel that they need or other products that they need. In the missile field, it's even more critical because they depend on more exotic materials, more exotic metals, and more exotic computer subcomponents for guidance. So Ukraine at one time, as I mentioned earlier, where they had a significant fraction of the Soviet industry, if you look at it today, the industry is much, much more constricted. It's much more limited. They're trying to build it up, clearly because of the recent wars from 2014 and the current war. There's currently a significant effort to build up the Ukrainian defense industry, but it's going to take decades. And it's not clear to what extent it will succeed.
And do you have a comparison to how much the Russian defense industry degraded after the fall of the Soviet Union? I assume that Russia spent way more investment into it, but I could be wrong.
Russia took a different approach than Ukraine did after the collapse of the Soviet Union regarding its defense industry. It had a very large fraction of its economy dependent on the defense industry. And so the government continued to try to make some investments. They didn't entirely succeed. And so what they tried to do, especially in the 1990s, is to push export. And so what you saw happen in the 1990s is the Russians put on a big export push. And so you can see it in some countries. So, for example, if you go back to the 1990s and you see Russian weapons exports to India and China, those exports were keeping the Russian industry alive. If you look at specific programs, for example, if you look at the T-90 tank program, the only reason that the T-90 tank program stayed alive is that the Indians came in and put in a large order at Nizhny Tagil at the plant which builds T-90. And it was somewhat the same across the board. There were large numbers of Russian defense programs that stayed above water simply because they got export orders. So, for example, Mikoyan, who developed the MiG fighters, they didn't do very well in the export market. But in contrast, the other major design bureau, Sukhoi, who prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union was really a secondary bureau, they suddenly did very well in the export business. And so now their positions are reversed. Now Sukhoi is by far the dominant Russian aircraft, military aircraft manufacturer, and Mikoyan has almost disappeared. They're barely holding their head above water. So you did see some changes there, and it was largely due to the success one way or the other in the export market. Then what happened in the 2000s is the Russian government started to try to modernize the Russian defense forces using the defense industry. And so you started to see some investment in new weapons. So, you start to see going from the old generation of tank like T-72, T-90 to a new generation like T-14. And so in the aircraft, you see a switch from the Su-27 family up to newer families like the Su-57 and that sort of thing. And you see it across the board. You start to see the government, Moscow, trying to invest in the industry and to develop new weapons. So they're throwing more money into research and development. They're improving the plants. It's not well recognized, but the Russians have opened up a bunch of new plants since 2000, since 2010. And it's the same reason that other countries do it. It's sometimes cheaper to establish a new plant rather than try to rebuild an old plant. And that's because, especially in cutting edge technology such as missiles, certain aviation fields, and certainly in military electronics, it's simply cheaper to build a new plant. So in the missile field, they went and built a couple new plants for surface to air missiles. There's a big business there. There's big export business. There's a big domestic business. So they've gone and built plants there. In more traditional industries such as tanks, that hasn't been the case. The main Russian tank plant in Nizhny Tagil is the same Russian plant that was established during World War II. It was the biggest plant in World War II. It's still the biggest plant. The other Russian tank plant over at Omsk was a secondary plant in World War II. It's still a secondary plant. It's still active, but it's not a primary plant. And that's true about a number of the traditional industries. But in the more dynamic aerospace field, there tends to be new plants.
Did Ukraine try to do the export focus, or was there, or didn't try it, or was there some severe limitations, like with licenses or something? Because you mentioned, for instance, for the ships, you said the design bureaus were basically all up north, and so maybe it was a licensing issue that we can only build it, but we would have to pay or something. Is it that, or?
I've been attending the international arms shows since the early 1990s. So there's the big international shows such as IDEX in Abu Dhabi. There's the Moscow Air Show in Moscow. There's Eurosatory in the Paris area. And so I've seen Ukrainian firms advertising at these shows for decades. And I remember when I first started to see Ukrainian firms starting to advertise in the early 1990s, they weren't very sophisticated. They obviously had no money. They had no money for displays. The products that they showed were relatively simple. They understood that they had to export weapons in order to keep the defense industry alive, but in many cases, they didn't have a product that was attractive in the international market. In recent years, that's changed. Certainly in the past decade, the Ukrainians have come up with a lot of products that are more internationally competitive. So the Luch Bureau in Kiev, which does anti-tank missiles, they have had some successes selling in the international market. The Ukrainian tank and armored vehicle industry has had moderate success, but we're talking in the dozens of tanks, not in the hundreds or thousands. They've had more success with light armored vehicles such as the BTR-3 and BTR-4. But what the industry ended up selling mostly through the 1990s and the early 2000s was old Soviet-era equipment. And so you'd see arms transactions involving the sale of old T-64 tanks or BTR-60s or old Soviet-era artillery pieces. And they did it basically just to make money in the hopes of keeping the business alive. But you can't support an industry selling old equipment. They could upgrade it, but even that doesn't involve enough money. So they tried to get into the new industry, but everybody else was trying to do the same thing. The Russians were trying to do that. The Belarusians were trying to do that. And then the other big dynamic in the international arms trade is all the new companies or new countries trying to get into that business. So, for example, Turkey. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, Turkey was simply not a player. They didn't have any new product. Now Turkey is a significant player. The same is true of South Korea. The products that South Korea were offering in the 1990s were basically just cheap copies of US products. Now you go to an international arms show, you see the South Korean stuff, they've got incredibly sophisticated equipment. I mean, they're competing in the European market for tanks. Norway's looking for a new tank. The Koreans are one of the competitors.
I think Poland signed a deal today with South Korea. Well, it was announced. I didn't sign. I saw something today. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so Ukraine wasn't only competing against the old ex-Soviet republics; they were also competing against these new republics. And of course, these new countries. The new countries, of course, have the advantage that their industries, their civilian industries, are doing very well, and so that helps the defense industry. Turkish industry is doing well. The Korean industry is doing well, and that spills over into the defense industry. The opposite was true of Ukraine. Ukraine's civilian industry was not doing well. They did well in the extractive industries, such as steel. Ukraine still had some good prospects in the steel field. They do some export of petroleum products. And of course, they're an agricultural country, so they succeeded in the agricultural field. But if you look in other aspects of the commercial products, say computer products or other sort of high-tech stuff, they weren't doing very well. And so that had a negative impact on the defense industry.
Thank you very much for your time and all the information.
Nice talking to you.
And thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.